open up for any question before we conclude. Is there any questions? Yes.
No, it doesn't. What happened was it's no longer an operating portion of the now Union Pacific Railroad and Amtrak, but you can go up and you can hike up there and you can actually walk through the snow sheds. Yeah.
So you can go through?
Yes, yes. Not always on a train.
Well, how long is it?
The tunnel is, it's like 1,660 feet, so 5 football fields. That's just one of them. There were 15 tunnels altogether, but it's the largest. Yeah.
So to build across the Sierra Nevadas, it took 15 tunnels to cross there. And the top 3 are 6, 7, and 8. The tunnel you saw is number 6. That's the longest one. That's 1,575 feet long. And it's through solid granite. And the trains don't run there now. It hasn't run a train there for 25 years. But it is still owned by the Southern Union Pacific Railroad now, or it's called Southern Pacific now. So what we want to try to do, it's also off limits. You're not supposed to be there. The railroad doesn't want you to be there. If you attend some other slides, some other presentation we have, you notice how much damage there's being done to that tunnel area. The graffiti is outrageous. Graffiti and things of this sort are there. And so one of the things that we would like to do, part of the 1880 Foundation and also Chinese American Citizens Alliance in general, is to say that that area should be made into a, listed as a historic monument, U.S. monument. So that's what we'd like to do. In fact, I would argue that it's a sacred ground, not just for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, but there is the old Donner Car and the old crossings by the Dutch Flat Roads. There are Indian pictographs there. And so it's a place that is sacred for a lot of people, and certainly for the Chinese, in which you have, like I said, almost 1,200 Chinese died building this railroad. So you should go up there and take a look at it. I don't know how many people were maimed or injured. And,
Trying to track down what happened to the Chinese workers is worse than looking for a needle in a haystack. There's actually an Irish researcher because if you notice, I didn't point it out, but on the payroll, you've got the Chinese headman listed with an Irish worker who was the foreman. So what this Irish researcher has done is track down the names of the Irish foremen, and if there were accidents where an Irishman died. And he's tried to triangulate the information. So when an Irishman died, it was usually listed in the paper. And there are several articles where the Irishman died along with Chinese workers. So by going back to the few railroad records there are, finds the Irishman's name, and then sees if it's listed with Chinese workers, who would be the headman or a helper, and then backtrack. But then there's never any information about whether, other than perhaps the Chinese dying, what the injuries were to the Chinese. Yeah.
you know, it's very interesting. They didn't keep the track of the actual workers, the individuals very much, and certainly not those that died. But part of the estimate of the 1 in 10 and part of the idea of finding 1,200 workers comes from estimates of how much poundage of bones were shipped back to China. So that what happens is that the railroad was committed to a lot of the associations that brought workers in. One of the conditions, or one of that they had, was that if somebody died on the railroad, then the railroad would be responsible for shipping bones back to their ancestral village where rites would be performed and so forth. So there's one record. Part of the idea of estimating how many people died was to take records that showed how much pounds of bones were shipped back. And I think they're saying came up with something like 12,000 pounds of bones. In a way, that's very interesting, but the other way, how disrespectful that is to just treat the pounds of bones as the people being shipped back.
So at the event 5 years ago, I had a friend who was in DC and is Chinese American, and you know, is second generation or has Asian immigrant parents, just like I do, although mine came from Japan, not China. But she told me that she believes that she also has an ancestor who may have been a railroad worker, and that there might be some stigma to that because I guess he came over to America, it didn't work out that great, he went back, and so I was wondering if you know, what proportion of railroad workers stayed and settled in the States, which is the ancestors of the descendants here versus ones who went back. And so there could be a lot of, I guess, post-1965 Chinese Americans who actually have an ancestor who worked on the railroads.
We don't know. We know some workers went back to China, some workers stayed. Some workers stay working for the railroad, but there's really nothing definitive. It's all of those, all of the above. And even with descendants, the descendants don't always know whether their ancestor worked on the Central Pacific, the first transcontinental railroad, or the subsequent rail lines that then blossomed to the feeder lines, or whether it was the Northern Pacific, or, so we really don't know. But we want to encourage people who think they may have connection to, go back and interview relatives, look for documents, look for little treasures that have been kept in the family so that we can look at it and maybe piece together things.
So it's pretty interesting that part of the things that we just don't know the actual numbers or estimates and stuff like this. And many of the people just can't afford to go back, right? I think this, if you go back, you can't come back because you do have the Chinese exclusion laws begin 12 years after the completion of this railroad like this. And so already we're having a lot of anti-Chinese feelings. After the completion of the railroad, you find a huge number of Chinese moving east and south. So a lot of that was following railroads that built down the southern line or the northern line. Or even there's a record, even in the local area of Virginia, we have one person, Harry and I have been doing some research around this area, and there's a story that we're trying to track down. Somewhere between Baltimore and here, was that Harry?
Well, Route 301. I heard from a friend of mine, I usually go to the, around this time of the year, to the Fossil Festival in North Carolina, so we drive down. And I was telling him what I was doing. I was helping the 1882 group in Chinese history in America. And he said, oh, I got something for you that you might be interested in. He said he knows this lady whose family owns a farm. And she told him a story about Chinese railroad workers that were killed. They were building the railroad around where the 301 bridge is between, I think it's Virginia and Maryland. And they found bodies all in the river, around anywhere from 50 to 200 bodies, because the railroad didn't want to pay them. So they decided to just go ahead and kill them. But I don't know how true it is. I got the number, I tried to call this person, a lady whose family owns this farm, and she never called back. I called 4 times. Then I asked my friend to talk to her, Bill, and he said she wanted to talk about it. She got a little afraid, so I couldn't go any further. I don't know if it's true or not. It's just so far rumors.
I did want to say, when I was reading comment about the 1965 Act, you're not sure if these guys who come back claiming to be descendants were actually people that came through the 65 Act. There are a lot of the Chinese workers here had families still in China at that time. So it's very likely that, and their children born there have not been able to come until the 65 Act. It's very likely, it is also possible that even if they came after 65, they're still descendants of railroad workers who never returned to be reunited with families in China. and their only way to come was only after the 65 Act.
Yeah, it's so complicated, convoluted. So you got laborers who worked on the railroad who were then prohibited from becoming naturalized by the 1882 Exclusion Act. Then you've got the interrogations that happened to enforce that act. So we've got descendants who only found out they were descendants of a railroad worker because they wanted to find out about their immigration history and went to the National Archives and found that usually not the railroad worker himself would have been interrogated, it would have been his wife, because his wife would have wanted to take a son or two back to China to marry because there were so few women here. And when she was interrogated, right, she would talk about the life they led wherever it was, right, properties owned, what occupation her husband had. And it's through those interrogations that those families can piece together the family story. And yes, there are descendants today. In fact, a very well-known woman in Salt Lake City who's like one of the leading Chinese American citizens, Margaret Yi. She was featured in some of the coverage about the 50th. She herself came as an immigrant, but her great-grandfather was a railroad worker who returned to China.
I just want to add a little bit information. And my grandfather was born in San Francisco, 1880. And in his early day, he worked for the president of Central Pacific. After China became a republic, there are lots of Chinese Americans went back to China and tried to make good in China. In case of my family, they went back. And they did quite well, for my grandfather. But eventually, when the communists take over in 1949, he came back to the United States. My grandfather had 4 children educated in here. That is a part of the story, back and forth.
We need to record your story. Are there any more questions?
I just wanted to mention, NPR had a recent program about the building of the railroad, and they spoke about some of the things that happened. I guess it was before OSHA, obviously, and some of the really terrible injuries. And one of them, the one that really stuck out in my mind, was that the dynamite would warm up because it was left out in the sun, and it would just blow up, and lots of people would end up dead. But it is on you can probably Google it and find it on NPR. And I saw on the slides that it was Lincoln that signed the act that paid or provided funding. It was also apparently his dream to, when the presidency was over, to take that railroad and go to the West Coast. Of course, he didn't live to do that.
You look at President Lincoln's legacy, and the building and his whole vision, not only because of the Civil War and the bringing together the Union, but his legacy of what he envisioned for the United States. There are 3 acts which he signed are so critical for the formation of the American nation. One was the Homestead Act, and we all know that, how we began to settle, fill in the middle parts of the United States. The other was the Land Grants Act, and we always recognize that not only do we have the people of the place, we also had to educate the people in order to maintain a democracy. But the other 3rd act he signed was the Pacific Railroad Act, and the Pacific Railroad Act was envisioned as the union of the country, physical union of the country. It is such a significant act, and the Chinese participation in it, as well as all the other immigrants, Mormons, Irish, Chinese, the main ones who are doing this, Confederate soldiers that were over finished, the entire building of the construction, from the engineers all the way down, the latest technology, the railroad construction, and the telegraph. All these things are so critical for the construction of the American nation, and the Chinese part of it has been so lost out. And what we want to do is make sure that that is part of the narrative as well.
So I think we have one last question.
I want to confirm. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted in 1882. Now, so when was this lifted? I mean, when were the Chinese allowed to live? Is it 1965?
Maybe step away from that.
Actually, Ted's immigration. But the China and the U.S. were allies in World War II. So in 1943, there was the Exclusion Act was repealed. Okay, in 1943, but it left in place a quota system, right? The national quota system, and the quota for Chinese in 1943 until 1965 was 105. So in fact, it was still in place because the quota was 105.
But it was official.
Right.
Just a quick note, when DOL started their whole thing, I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about this because I was so busy with my government job at DOT. And but the Department of Transportation in Southeast DC has a U.S. Transportation History Walk Museum for the external part of its headquarters, comprised of 2 buildings. So it's a museum of the history of the U.S. transportation and the inventions by the Wright brothers. So when it came to Transcontinental, they just had to go this like poster and the survey Theodore Judah up on the window panel. And it hit me, maybe God is saying, hey, you knew what you were doing at DOL. Was that, Jeanette, you got to push to get the Chinese railroad workers recognized in this outdoor museum so the public can see this. So I put it in the Idea Hub program at DOT. And it took about a year and a half. It took a while for them to, they supported it. And they got funding. And you will see that it's up there now. I can get this. On the corner of 4th and M Street near Harris Teeter of the East Building of the U.S. Department of Transportation History Walk Museum, at the East Building of the headquarters, you got 2 headquarters buildings. 4th and M Street Southeast, you will see at the beginning of that East Building the Chinese railroad workers being recognized. Also, the African Americans at DOT wanted another window panel to commemorate the African Americans who worked on the Southern Railroad. And you will see, that's the African American panel. But I also have something to say. I went to the Utah May 10th big conference of the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association. Sue was there and Ray Sue and her husband. When we were at Ogden, there was a museum and they had a little postcard. And those 3 Chinese guys that you said, they were at the 50th anniversary of Transcontinental in 1919. They were on a float. And they showed that yeah, I have it in here somewhere in this little cell phone. Yeah, take a picture of it. And so they're on a float. Oh, yeah.
So if you're interested in the 3 people and you want some one of these things, there's actually a commemorative stamp that was issued this year, May 10th, and it commemorates that. Then if you want to buy the stamp, put it on an envelope with these 3 guys and mail it back to yourself. then you can have and you mail it to a certain address, you can get a first day issuance for your stamp. If you want one of these things, you know, stop by, come by and see me later. Also, if you're interested in hearing more about the stories, actually reading the stories, Sue has a few of these books. You come talk to her about it. And, right? It does cost $25. A person goes to he goes to the Chinese Historical Society. But I just wanted to put in a plug because she's too shy to put in a plug for herself. And she doesn't want to carry it.
Right.
So, thank you everyone. I think that completes the